So the last two chapters are chapter 10, which is entitled A Decent Life for All, and chapter 11, Reclaiming America. And as many of our authors have done in the books that we've read, we spend, the first part of the book, talking about issues and problems and things and their observations. And then thankfully, by the end, they are trying to focus more on remedies or ways that we can change things. And I think Joseph Stiglitz did that here. With respect to A Decent Life for All, he's really trying to focus on what it means to actually have a stable middle class, which is something that developed very well in our history after World War II. Except some of the programs that were in place at that time didn't necessarily include people of color and women, who were largely left out. But to otherwise, there was a lot of focus on post World War II, a building of our middle class. He identifies four key components for a thriving middle class. They are healthcare, retirement, home ownership, and education. And for each of those, he has pointed out ways in which we have taken some steps in the past to provide public support for them, to essentially correct things that the market itself doesn't account for. And he spells those out, and he feels that since World War II, or since the 1980s, there's been an erosion of support for each of these things, possibly with the exception of some of the progress that was made with respect to healthcare under the Obama administration. But even that, from his perspective, was not enough. With respect to retirement, we have had the concept of Social Security around for a while, which is a very big improvement. And at the same time, there are some conservative forces that are, he talks about during the Bush era, efforts to push that towards privatization, which, if that had actually happened prior to the 2008 market collapse, think of where we would be. And then with respect to home ownership, your support for mortgages is another area in which he points out how the private sector itself has determined that they're not going to be able to do this, so they foist a certain amount of responsibility on the public sector. And this is, again, the area where there may be some public support for it, but it's done in a way that essentially enables the companies not to fail, but individuals in the end may be paying the price, as happened in the 2008 downturn. And then he talks about education again, and the difference between those who come from families who've already had the benefits of education, being able to use that as a springboard for their children, and how that continues to make things unequal. So he's talked about a public option for each of these. He also talks about what he calls a mythology that we have here in this country, where we are a nation of rugged individualists. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and everything that is a success here is based on the concept of the self-made man, self-made woman, self-made person. And he basically says, is there really such a thing? Do people truly start from zero? Most of the people who succeed really aren't starting from zero in comparison with everybody else. And they are not necessarily taking into account that some of the advantages that they have. And what he points out to is, when we do find some of those success stories, rags to riches or Horatio Alger story, we play that up like it's everybody's opportunity. And those stories are that's part of the mythology, without necessarily recognizing that many of us who are successful in life have not started from nothing. We've had a head start. The last thing that he talks about, and he expresses a lot of concern, and this is something that touches me personally, because I'm not a government servant now, but I was a government servant for over 20 years, is the essentially spreading a propaganda about the ineffectiveness of government generally. I think Reagan was the person who said, if if you want something done, don't give it to government, or I can't remember exactly what the quote was. But Stiglitz points out that that really does undermine all of the good work that government does and the necessary work that government does. He points out that it's not as opaque and misguided as everyone thinks. He points to the way that we have transparency in our rulemaking process. That's something that we'll talk about in the questions, but I think he is a big proponent of having a responsible and good government do the things that government needs to do. And in the end, he basically says, if we don't put more public participation or more government resources into things to help, he basically says, these are the types of things that will help capitalism save itself from itself. And I think that I found that the ending of the book, although we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, it does point out some things that could be done, and we'll get into those in the questions and answers. So that's it, I think, Wes, unless you guys want to add anything further. Oh, I'm sorry, one other thing that he talks about, and we'll get into this with one of our specific questions, is a new social contract. And he thinks through what needs to be done and what needs to be valued and focusing our values. And I'm not going to read through all of those, but we'll flash them up later in the discussion when we have a question that's focused on the new social contract. And much like we have norms and behaviors in book club, maybe what we can consider the new social contract, something that we could all aspire to and have each other focus on in the future.
Thank you, Jamel. Appreciate it. Shannon sends their thanks in the chat as well. So, all right. Well, let's get it started with question number 1. Peg, do you mind facilitating this discussion?
Sure, Wes, because it actually ties in with how Jamel just finished up with the summary about a new social contract and a new set of values. So our first question tonight is, what are American values and how do they inform our public policies, programs, and economic perspectives? Do the values that we tell ourselves match reality, sorry. And if you give me a second, I can put that into the chat, that question. But what are American values and how do they inform our public policy?
Wes is very good at waiting for folks to jump in.
Annette has her hand up.
I think for me, when I think of kind of what's at the center of American values is equality. When the rubber meets the road, we're all, equal, particularly under the law. So for me, that's kind of a real central theme of our American values. Whether we actually live up to that or not is all too often we just don't. I mean, we can we just don't, and we are certainly, and Stiglitz is bringing that up over and over and over and over again, is the privilege of the rich and the fact that money has political power and keeps the average person out of the loop of having any kind of influence. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Annette. Mary?
Um, I think individualism for me is one of the more important values yesterday and today. I think values morph over time, and certainly diversity wasn't always our value. Equality wasn't always our value, and we're still struggling with those two today. But we are becoming more aware of the importance of it in order to have a more balanced society. Unity is out the window today. It was not true in the past. I think we are more unified as a country because we taught values in school. We taught, the principles of government, and we taught patriotism in school, and now it's not. And that really has influenced our value system and how we carry it out today. And government by the people, again, yesterday was a different level. Government by the people. Now it's government by corporations and by billionaires, and the brink of autocracy is not making it any better. So I believe that our values have changed over time, and that is reflected in policies and fights over policies and undoing policies that made sense in the past and now are being put on the table again in this revolving door that we have with government and the private sector. It's like it's indistinguishable.
Thank you, Mary. Jamal?
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to share, there are a couple of things, but the one thing that I want to focus on is that I guess I've always thought that we, as a country, there's a certain amount of resilience and there's a certain amount of adaptability. I would like to see more of that, in the future in terms of how America responds to things or how the country responds to challenges. But embedded within some of the things that he says, he does point out we have been in periods of great inequality and injustice before, and we have somehow responded to that, and changed things for the better. And so that's why I think he ends saying, we need to do that again. We have done it in the past. It may be more difficult now because things are more complicated than they were even in the past. But we do have examples of having recovered from the robber baron era, by establishing the concept of antitrust laws. We came out of depression with a number of social programs, and as we said, they didn't necessarily work for everybody, but they did work to create some broader equality and a broader middle class in the middle of this century. So I guess in terms of a value, I look at that. I look hopefully, at some of that creativity that people do come together and they can find a way forward. And it's him and books like that and stuff that we're doing that we really have to focus on. So we don't give up hope. I guess that might be a value, just and I hope it continues.
Agreed. And if we look at how chapter 11 starts off, it's the inscription from the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I wonder if that really still rings true today. I wonder if we would consider putting that on a Statue of Liberty today when there's all this border crisis and hostility about people coming from other countries and all of that kind of stuff. You know, but also Stiglitz mentions right under the quote that was in our question. What he is referring to are the values that inform our public policies, public programs, and economic perspectives. And I think it becomes kind of convenient to say, oh, well, you know, we're America, we're resilient, we're always changing, we're innovative, but then it becomes more entrenched with this is the way things have always been done. And so it's a real diametrical change in how we approach making things better and more equitable even for each other public in terms of public policy, because the second part of the question is, do the values that we tell ourselves match reality? And I mean, at least here in this space, excuse me, we share a common value of equality, and we cherish that, and we cherish that individual right. But you know, if you look to other people, that's not what their reality is, and they wouldn't necessarily consider that a reality. So does anyone else have anything to add to question 1?
You know, I think Stiglitz nails something, and you know, it can be hard even as grassroots organizers that we're talking, the importance of expressing our values within political conversations, whether that's our conversations with that family member, you know, at a holiday gathering, or when we're writing and debating policy. But if we can talk values like equality, it would then be very hard for Republicans to argue against something, because then they're arguing against equality. And so helping frame our messaging around certain values, I think, could be really effective. And there are some public officials who do that well. You know, I think one thing with President Biden, you know, the soul of our nation was kind of that theme he used in 2020. And I think that resonated with folks. So
I
Um,
agree. Thanks for sharing, Wes. Did you
yeah.
have something else to say?
No, I was perplexed because Zoom popped. It looks like you're done talking, so we're gonna lower your hand, and I've never seen that happen before. So yeah, that's it. Looks
Okay.
like Carl and Patricia.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Carl.
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. One of the values that I think a lot of people take for granted and that's slowly being chipped away at by the Republicans is simply the right to choose. The right to choose who you want to lead you, the right to choose what you do with your body, right to choose where you live, where you work, and so on and so on and so on. And I'm concerned that that is people don't think about that as something that they would treasure as much as democracy. But the reason we have so many conflicts is because there's a lot of people that want to take that choice away from us, not just for reproductive rights, but for everything else that we do. And that's kind of, it was mentioned about autocracy. And it seems that that is becoming very popular, and I'm not sure why, and I don't understand. Maybe I haven't read this book yet, and I'm kind of jumping in the middle at chapter the last 2 chapters, but I'm looking for answers in that, in how people actually think that's right, is to take the right to choose away from another person.
Well stated. Thank you, Carl. And Patricia,
Unmute. Hi. Hi. One of the things that American values, the question was, what are American values and how do they form public policy? At the turn of the century, I believe, or was it? Okay, I know that President Roosevelt's wife was a stickler for the women's suffrage movement. And at that time, women who had husbands that came back from the war or didn't come back from the war, who were broke, didn't have any money, because at that time, women basically depended on their husbands for support. And when husbands left or they died, the women didn't have any money. So the system was created, which was the welfare system, or was it Social Security? Anyway, two of the systems was developed so that people wouldn't die of hunger and starvation. They had money to support themselves. So there was that, the Social Security and the welfare system was created so that indigent and elderly and widows could live. And we should still have those programs. We still have women who depend on their husbands for support. There are a lot of women that don't work, they stay home, they get married, they take care of their children, they support their husbands in that way. What happens when the husband dies? What happens when the husband divorces the woman? We still need those programs in effect. Let me see. That was my thought.
thank you, Patricia. Jamal, did you have something else?
Yeah, just one other thing really, quickly. I mean, he talks about the 80s, and I think I can't remember which era, was named which, but we went through the period of the me decade, basically, where people, I mean, it's not just this notion of individualism, do things, those that work hard are the ones that are going to succeed. It was almost, it's almost as if, and he points out this, what he thinks is a bad value that has crept in, or has been accentuated more recently, is you do things for yourself, and if there's nothing in it for you, you're not going to be thinking about society. And I find that very dangerous, and you can see it. I'll just say, I come from a family where my dad, was an immigrant, my mom, first generation, and they did not have much, but they succeeded. So on the one hand, I've been able to live that whole notion of, look at those examples of people who have succeeded, they become part of our mythology. But it's very clear that I benefited, from that. And I can't, and I have to remember that I benefited from that, and that my children have benefited from that. And I mean, I guess you could look at it, you could look at it as, well, I'm entitled to the success that others have had, and I don't want to lose it. Or because I've got that, I have to think about how I pay back. So I don't know. I guess I'm rambling a little bit on that one, but that whole notion of people not just working for themselves, but if you are successful, you're thinking how you're going to contribute to others.
And along that line, Jamal, I've heard it say that, the World War II and post World War II generation, they work to be able to forge a better way for their children. And when I look at my grown children, I'm not sure that I was able to really do that for them. I mean, not in the same way that that generation did. I did that on my own. Whereas that past generation, a lot of them, and it's not a matter of getting into the ins and outs of happy marriage and all of that. But it's a matter of I did that on my own. And I'm not sure that they would even look and say, oh, well, you know, it was so easy for us, because it wasn't. It was desperately hard. Um, and they had to really push and persevere in a way that I did not have to push and persevere. So I can't be comfortable in saying to myself, I've made a better life for them. They have made a better life for themselves. And I think that reflects, you know, the shift in society too. Annette has her hand up, and then we'll move on to the next question. And I do want to give a quick public notice to welcome Robin, who joined us late, but thanks for coming on. It's great to see you.
So much for sneaking in there.
Go ahead, Annette.
Glad you're with us, Robin. What I wanted to say is I am so aware that I am totally a recipient of the fact that my dad was a Mexican boy who worked in the mines, never spoke English until he went to school, but he joined the Air Force, and after World War II, the world was his oyster. He did not have a college education. He just was a really excellent worker. He was a smart man. And he had, seriously, I mean, the world was his oyster, and he became very successful. That, speaking of which, that speaking of that, we are not just self-made people, but it's the circumstance around us that gives us the opportunity. He was definitely that, and I am definitely a recipient of that. I am so aware of that. As a matter of fact, I had to tell him how lucky that he was. And he never really saw that until I had that conversation with him. But I am so aware that I am a recipient of the World War II boom, that opportunities I had. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. And I think I can copy and paste the next question. Thank
I
you,
already
Wes.
got it for you.
Yep, thank you. Do we
I'm gonna have-
idolize our Constitution too much? If so, how can we break ourselves of such idolization?
And Jamel, I'm gonna kick it to you to facilitate. Thanks, Peg.
Yeah, I think that yeah, I'll just some of this comes from the fact that some of the very instruments that we hold out so much, as being part of our culture, you can see right in them. They were not perfect. They do have flaws. The flaws are still there. We've corrected some of those flaws, but the whole point was we took steps to correct things and change things. And now, to the extent that there's a view out there that, well, we can't do X or Y because it's not in the Constitution, or it's not what the original intent was. Do we need to free ourselves from that, as we have done in the past when we've made some amendments? So that's the question for folks, and let's see who's got some thoughts on that. And I like the fact that somebody, before you go, Carl, I like the fact that somebody said in the chat, I saw, just because we might feel the need to change something or improve something doesn't mean that we hate it. I think that's a great thing to think about, with respect to the Constitution as we talk about this question. Go ahead, Carl.
Can you hear me?
Yep, there you go.
Oh, okay, sorry. I think there's some abuse of that, and we have some good examples from certain former presidents that say they can say anything that they want because there's freedom of speech in the Constitution. So, in terms of relying on the Constitution too much, there are some bad examples out there. And then the other one is the Second Amendment, is that everyone has a right to have a gun. So it's been abused. But the perfection of the Constitution is, I think, the fact that it's not perfect, and it's constantly needing to be updated in terms of, like you said, the amendments, and as well as a rational, and I think I want to put emphasis on rational interpretation of the Constitution. And so recently it's been more weaponized than it has been cherished. And so that's my 2 cents worth.
Thanks, Carl. And we've got Peg and then Connie.
Thanks, Jamal. And Carl was so articulate and well stated, but I don't know about idolizing the Constitution or not idolizing the Constitution, but one thing is for sure, the Constitution is the law of our land. It's not an idol that we bow down to. And so I think it's important that we keep it in its proper perspective and not be extreme one way or another, not completely discard it and not completely embrace it blindly. But the Constitution is the backbone of our country, but it's not the entire body of what makes America the country that it is, for better or for worse. It's just the backbone that supports and gives us foundation as Americans.
Thanks, Peg. Connie, let me ask you to unmute.
Yeah, okay.
There you
Yeah, I was just gonna say the same thing about guns as Carl did, but specifically with the Supreme Court, that they have really, taken literally, they think, what the founders meant about guns. And I think that that's been really a very big problem and very political. That's, what I say.
I'm curious. I'll share two things, and then I'll turn it over to you, Robin. One, has anybody, does anybody have an experience where they just decided to read one of the opinions from the Supreme Court on a constitutional issue? See if they could follow it. It's stuff like Peg's got her hand up, so maybe she'll jump in on that. And the other is, I'll confess, my wife and I are both lawyers by training, and we have a copy of the Constitution in our kitchen cupboard, and we will, if we see something, we will pull it out, and just sort of like, let's see what the Constitution actually says. And there's a lot of room for interpretation in there. Robin, and then Patricia. You're on mute. Let me,
Sorry.
there you go.
Yeah. I can't remember the exact language that Carl used, but it was something along the lines of being rational in our interpretation and application of the Constitution, because the document itself was written over 200 years ago. Our society was vastly different when it was written to what it is today. Our society looks a lot different. Our morals are a lot different than when that document was written. And when I haven't read some of the justice opinions, but I've listened to them read their opinions and try to follow their specific rationale. And again, just to go back to what Carl says, it feels like it has been weaponized in order to minimize rights because of the fact that it was written at a time that our society was so vastly different. And there's the term that I'm learning about, or started learning about once we got some of our recent justices, about originalism, and to take it within the context of originalism for a society that does not mirror our own does not always make sense to me. So I feel that, like you said, it's used to weaponize as opposed to empower everyday citizens. I feel like a lot of people want the Constitution to be something that is meant to empower everyday Americans, but I don't always feel that that's how it's used.
Thanks, Robin. Patricia. Oh, let me ask you to unmute. There you go.
Right, I'm just going to piggyback on what Robin said about the Constitution being written hundreds of years ago. Things were different 100 years ago. I like the idea that we have a Constitution. Like Peg said, it's a basis for us to grow upon, and it does need to be changed. Some things need to be looked at. Second Amendment is one of them, of many. It's obvious that, we need to change some things when you have mass murders and people walking around killing groups of people, lots of people. I mean, it's ridiculous. Some people should not have the right to bear arms, period. Don't you agree? So then that law needs to be changed. A lot of things in the Constitution that needs to be changed, and it should be looked at line by line by intelligent people, of course. And the things that need to be changed should be changed.
Thanks, Patricia. Annette, you've got your hand up, and then we'll see if there's anything more, but then we might move on to the next one. But go ahead, Annette. Oh, asking you to unmute. There you go.
I was having trouble with that. Something also that I've observed is when politicians and our favorite last president has used that's unconstitutional, and it can be anything from your choice to have something to eat to, I mean, stupid stuff that they call unconstitutional. And I think it's used frequently as as a hyperbolic. It's a trigger word. To say that something is unconstitutional becomes a trigger word, and I really get tired of hearing the narrative of anything that I disagree with or anything I don't want, then it becomes unconstitutional, and then you can get rid of it or you can add it to it. Am I explaining myself right, or am I just really okay? Thanks, Carl. Thanks for the shake of the head.
No, you're doing fine on that. I'm going to, before we move on, I am going to make sure folks, I don't know if everybody follows the chat as we do this, but Tracy has made, some excellent points in the chat. She points out the fact that, there's a difference between originalism and idolizing the Constitution. And she says that she idolizes it in part because it's subject to change and interpretation. And then she's also, in terms of the times have changed, and just as our language has changed too. So words had different meanings back then, and we need to take those things into consideration as well. So that spawned some stuff. Robin and then Wes.
So I guess I'd like to ask then, what is, and this isn't specifically for Tracy, for anyone really, what specifically is your understanding of originalism? I know what my understanding is based off of what I thought I knew, but I mean, I get that other people may have different interpretations, different understandings. My understanding may be wrong. So I would love to learn and hear what other people think about that and what that word means.
And here's Tracy. Thanks, Tracy. I'm going to unmute you.
I try to take that to mean people trying to, take a crystal ball and figure out what the writers of the Constitution meant 250 years ago almost. When we'll never know. I mean, they always read into what they say about wanting to have some kind of connection with church and state, when most of them were borderline atheists, and the different mechanical capabilities of a rifle or a musket, as it were, in those days, and what we have for weapons now, they don't allow for the changing of technology, even though they're granting that they want original language. It's just so much convoluted crap, basically trying to read what the original guys meant versus what today's life is all about. That just is the source of a lot of the friction between the Constitution and what we're looking at right now. That's the way I take it.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks for sharing that observation. That made it clear for me. Mary.
I think the originalism is a justification for the extreme right-wing interpretation of events and reversal of events such as abortion and it's going against public opinion. It's going against representative democracy, and it's originalism. It's impossible to determine what the original interpretation of the Constitution as it was written. It was written for white landowning males, and this is not today's society. So originalism shouldn't even be used as a reference point. It should be modified to include terminology and concepts that we accept today as a society, and it should be a composite of from citizens to professors to law professors. It needs to be done over a process of time. Right now, I think originalism is a pretext for extremism.
Thank you, Mary. Well, that was a lot, a good discussion and some stuff to think about. Wes, do you want to move us on to the next question, or Robin?
Yeah, I will go and then Robin will do the next one. So I believe we're on question 3. And so question 3, share my screen here so you can see it. What would it take to restore trust? And that's all I remember. There we go. In our institutions and our politicians for a wide and diverse swath of constituents. So what would they need to do? They, as in our institutions and our politicians, to get a wide, diverse swath of constituents to restore trust in them. And I put the question in the chat as well. Go ahead, Robin.
I think one thing, at least that our institutions need to do, I don't know so much about politicians, they need a little bit more work, but I feel like our institutions need to be less partisan I know last week we talked a lot about like the post office, for instance, like why in the world would like conservatism versus liberalism come into me getting my mail? You know what I mean? And or like counting votes. Like that shouldn't even like be a thing. And it's like when the stories get explained, then we know how and why. But as an institution, you exist to do this thing. And that should be the thing that you do. Period. So I think I would have trust in those organizations if they did the things that they were created for, that they were constructed for. And then for organizations like the IRS, because we talked about that maybe like 2 weeks ago, if we could have confidence that the ways in which they are implementing their mandates are considering how they can potentially inadvertently be propagating harms and discriminations that we already have embedded in our systems. Because one of the things we were talking about, or maybe I was just reading a few weeks ago, is how our tax system perpetuates racism because we audit poor people and people of color more heavily than we do rich white people. So that is a way that that institution is propagating racism. So even though people can feel that they need to inject partisanship in that, it's really them removing the partisanship in the way that they are implementing their mandates.
Thank you, Robin. Really appreciate that. As Annette said, you're making too much sense. Patricia, go ahead.
Stickler talked about the government and how the government employees, weren't doing such a good job. He talked about professionalism, how, if you're in the government, you should, be professional. People have to look at, have to be ethical, and that's true. People who are hired, especially in a management position where you have other people looking up to you, they should be held at a higher standard. They should be educated to be able to deal with all walks of people. I think training is very important too. Training, education in the different departments of the institutions should be constant. It should be ongoing. People have to be taught how to think in certain situations. They have to learn or unlearn a lot of negative habits and ways that they were taught. And psychologically, people should be tested on psychologically on a regular basis. Because, just like we get sick physically, some people get sick psychologically, yet they're here in a position of government in an institution, and, they're bringing this sickness onto other people. So, I mean, it's a constant thing, but we have to constantly do it. It doesn't just stop once you get hired. It doesn't. We have to look at, opinions, surveys, the people who are constituents of these institutions. And it's a good thing because, we survey to death. Wherever you go, there's going to be a survey. Those things should be looked at. Surveys should be looked at, and people's, your job performance should be looked at on a regular basis. The people that you serve should be able to write about you, what you did, what was good, what was bad, blah, blah, blah. We have to take things seriously. We're not taking things seriously. And that's when the problems start. That's just my opinion.
Thank you, Patricia. And some folks in the chat had said some similar things there. Tracy said listening is a good start. So, Vanessa.
I was gonna say probably one of the biggest things that comes to mind is the fact that, and we're going through that now, is the battle for, the avoiding a government shutdown. Someone brought up the IRS. The funding for the IRS and their enforcement wing of the IRS has drastically reduced, which means they have less people working to enforce taxes on especially the rich. You're cut funding to public health agencies that are supposed to be there to protect the public. You're cutting funding from education. So now you have schools shutting down, or they're in such a terrible state of physical status that it's not even healthy to even go to attend school. Or you have the mass shooting situation. I mean, funding is the biggest thing, and politics, I don't know how you separate the two. Politics should never play with government funding. There should be that clear division, rather that being the usual game that we play every year. You're affecting all the services that are needed, whether it's basic services or making government agencies more effective. Someone's talking about surveys. I mean, I would say that's kind of something you worry about way later, because, people, customers can be just as cruel as government employees. But the thing is everybody needs money to run appropriate programs or whatever platforms that they want to promote to make this country more effective in several ways. And so that's the biggest thing that I think affects all agencies, is the fact that you have the House of Representatives, senators, even depending on who's president, playing games with the funding of all these agencies, and the fact that they even have the right and power to appoint the head person for all these agencies, rather than somebody who's worked in this system, or who has not just the professional background, but the educational background to appropriately reflect those agencies. So you had, what was it, DeVos representing the Department of Education? How was that possible? Yet that was possible, and that should be removed. That power should be removed from Congress. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Vanessa, as a public school teacher. Yes, that appointment is still mind-blowing. But I see it happening all the time in our local politics, when you literally see school board members who do not want to promote public education, but they're making laws for the public schools of their district. It is, and when it comes to money, yeah, I think the one thing is, what do these institutions, what do they put their money towards? And what are they spending that on? That can be a good reflection of rebuilding trust. So Jamel, and then I believe we got 2 more questions, and I really want to devote some time to, like, 5 minutes to our wrap up, since it's our last week.
Okay.
Jamel.
I would just say, again, I mentioned that I was in government, and there are ways in which government holds itself accountable and is under a microscope. And so you can look at how much money goes in, and you can look at what services are delivered as a result of that. And I'm really glad that Vanessa raised the issue of the IRS. It's very clear. It's simple math. Everybody understands that if every dollar that's spent providing resources to the IRS pays itself back many times over, because it helps collect revenue that is owed under taxes from people who are figuring out ways to avoid it. It's very simple math. And if you haven't read the last 2 chapters, Stiglitz does a good job explaining that despite the fact that a lot of people think that government is wasteful, there are very clear examples of how the government has stepped in and done a better job than the private sector ever could do or would want to do, with respect to certain things. And so he's trying to, part of that is to actually have people champion that and to actually say, we do need to push back against this notion of we don't need government or government is too big. He points out the fact that the government itself, the number of employees in the government has been roughly stable for the past half century. And yet the population has increased significantly, and the demands of government, have increased significantly as well. So yes, there are situations where you are going to have waste in government. You're going to have waste everywhere, but you have to identify and champion those places where you really need to push for it. And so I think he's looking for champions of government, not and it doesn't have to be necessarily one particular policy or a single issue or something like that, but just champions for good government. Sorry.
Champions for good government. I like it. And that is a great segue into our next question that Robin is going to facilitate. So, Robin, take it away.
Sure. So, Stiglitz provides us with several key points that he labels as a new social contract. Basically, what we need to have in order for our country to be able to move forward. So let me move this out of the way because it's blocking my screen. So considering that new social contract, choose one tenet and describe how you think it can or should be implemented. And then also, are there any overarching ideals that you see applying to most of the tenants? So for an example, I personally believe that an overarching ideal that we need to apply to all of the tenants is to consider the history of racism and how it impacts the way we implement environmental regulations, how we implement opportunities and how that's shared, how we implement education. So what are some things that you think need to be applied to all of the tenants? And also how everyone's voice is heard in the democracy. That definitely applies as a place we need to consider racism. So any thoughts? So Mary, I see you have your hand raised.
To have a vote. I think that the federal government needs to set federal standards for all states and a federal agency that dictates the standards, and that everybody's issue, like in Mexico, my mother had a Federal Election Commission FEC card that was issued by the government, not by the state, or each one, figure out how you're going to go get a certain list of things that you have to prove yourself, and state by state, it's too disconnected, and there's also more abuse when a system is not controlled by the main government. I think this is one of the things that needs to happen for all the other things to happen. If we don't have one person, one vote guaranteed, despite your melatonin and despite your personality, despite your zip code, we're not going to get any of the other lists going. So I think that, to me, that's one of the most important things, to federalize our elections once and for all. All states mandate one set of rules and regulations and election dates and holidays for elections. this and take the whole 2 weeks to turn in your votes. I mean, all the democracies all over the world, true democracies, they're vastly different than the way things are run here, where there's so much abuse. You know, you don't get to redistrict every 5 minutes to ensure and squash the one person, one vote precept.
Yeah, that's a great point and a great idea too, Mary, because just a quick example, a lot of people are like, oh, what's the big deal if you have to have an ID to vote? I remember reading an article about how in some states they let students use their student ID in order to vote. In Texas, they would not allow a student ID to vote, but they did allow you to use a gun registration ID to vote. And having different rules in what counts as an ID also impacts who is more like which demographics are more likely to be showing up at the polls with those specific types of IDs.
Or certain places where you have to go to the sheriff's office to show your ID. You know, people are shivering to show their face because you may not get to be alive after you leave that sheriff's office, or you know, you'll be fined for something, or they'll find something on you, and people are terrorized. So we got to remove this terrorism to establish the one person, one vote guaranteed.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Shannon, I see you have your hand raised. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yes, I wanted to follow up on a previous comment I made in the chat about enlightened self-interest. I realize that it's in such disuse nowadays that people may not understand what I was talking about, but it comes into play here when you talk about the social contract. I think it's very important for us to be aware why people should buy into the social contract. It is because we're compassionate towards others and so forth for the common good, but it's also because we all do better when we all do better. And that's what enlightened self-interest was about, was that you'd realize that there were comments made earlier about people doing well and all the people it takes to help you do well.
Wes, is it possible to put the question back up on the screen, because we have a lot of information on that slide for people to need to read? I think it's in the chat, but as people comment in the chat, we're losing visibility to see the question. And Patricia, I see you have your hand up, so I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yes, Stiglitz mentioned one tenet was every individual has the opportunity to live up to their full potential. I'm thinking about, let's just say you have an individual who might be mentally challenged. That person has the right to be able to live the best that he can, but the government should help that individual by maybe offering classes that he could take, you know, so that he could be a part of society, get a job, you know, maybe offer housing for that person. Because I know a lot of kids that grew up, you know, they had developmental problems, let's put it that way. And they got old, their parents died, and they had to be put in institutions because they were never taught to take care of themselves. The government can help with that because they can be taught. We can all be taught, you know, but we just don't have the facilities. We don't have the institutions, or, you know, the funding is not there so that, you know, people, I'm just using them as an example, but everybody should have the opportunity to self-realization, to self-realize themselves, to live up to their best, highest potential. So that's the one thing that Stiglitz said that that stuck with me.
Thank you, Patricia. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next question? Oh, Nelson, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, hey everyone. Nelson calling in from the San Francisco Bay Area. And this has been, at least for one of the issues about the social contract and enacting equity. Housing is a real big issue, locally, statewide, nationally for everyone. But I'm looking at these questions, and a big problem was a lot of people that were fighting for this 15 years back decided there has to be an expansion of HUD, right? In order to, actually build our housing, because too much of it is in the hands of the private sector. And of that, you only get very incremental solutions, right? A new apartment building comes up, they're willing to give 9% of it at the absolute maximum, maybe 20% of it as affordable housing. And that is one of the stabilizing factors in ensuring, high human development, index, right? But it's like, it was a policy platform going 15 years back, at least here when we knew that there was a major crisis going on, and it kind of never went into play. And now it's even worse because what you see is that there are fake lobbies that look progressive, right? Like it's called YIMBY out here, trying to produce this housing. I mean, we have half the state's homeless population. We have 300,000 unhoused people on the streets. And now even what worries me some more is that we're kind of in this trajectory of an aging nation, right? Where there's going to be a big asset transfer for Gen X, of which half will inherit something, some maybe a large pool of assets. And then you have this bottom half that's going to get nothing, that the state needs to take care of while you need to fund, all the measures for long-term care for an aging population. Now, circling back to the social contract and providing those needs and going back to, the needs for housing on the federal level, all that we're seeing from them now is we can expand Section 8 spending. But that's not a real solution because most landowners and property owners don't want to accept that, right? So you're just kind of, rolling out something that is not going to really be that beneficial. I mean, I really do think, and I don't know how this is going to happen, but there actually does really need to be an expansion on the federal level, right, to expand the social contract in providing housing and all of that. But I'm getting scared because what I've really seen play out, at least out here for the affluent, is they just migrate their money elsewhere. Okay, like I mean, my friend's mom back in the 90s, she was, third in the ranks at Calvin Klein. She bought cheap in Malibu, had all that, had $1 million in appreciation, had a stable retirement. In the end, she was like, F all these taxes. She went down to Baja California, Mexico. She set up shop there, and this is not isolated, all right? So, I mean, I just have to say this on top of the other crises that we're about to confront in the commercial real estate sector imploding, we got to factor all this in playing out question 4. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you for sharing, Nelson. That was really informative. Something I hadn't considered. Gave us a lot to think about. Appreciate it. So Wes, I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna lie, I just got on Twitter and I saw that President Obama released a medium statement about the situation going on in Israel and Palestine. And I don't want to get into that discussion, but there was a part that talks about it is morally just and reflects our belief in the inherent value of every human life. And upholding that value is vital for building alliances, shaping international opinion, and the long-term security for Israel. And then just goes on to, talk about how there's moments in US history where we have truly neglected that value or belief that there is value in every human life. We can think back to westward expansion, slavery, how we responded after 9/11, in terms of how we treated and valued the lives of our Arab Muslim Americans, and so I just think trying to think to me that value of human life, and it kind of goes with what Patricia said, and every individual has the opportunity to live to their full potential, but you can't even say there's full potential if you don't see value in every human life. And so just reading that, I think that to me, that's kind of part of the conversation is if we truly don't value every life, then how can we even see all these to fruition? So yeah, just something that I connected with, and I got sidetracked in our conversation. So yeah.
That's a great point though, Wes. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else have any thoughts before we move on? I think we might need to, given the time. Do we have time for question 5 or should we skip it?
I think we'll need to skip because I do want to give some time to some closing things, but I thought we should do poll questions at least to, and so.
And also, while we do the poll question, if we're not going to ask the question specifically, I think it wouldn't hurt if Jamel, if you're okay with maybe taking a minute or two to kind of walk people through the those resources that we have, because a lot of times our more info is passive information, but these 2 resources are active information, ways that you can get involved. So maybe while the poll question is up, Jamel can kind of just take us through what these 2 or links are.
Sure.
I love that idea. And real quick, Jamel, I actually created 2 poll questions. And so we'll make this first one real quick. So I'm already launched it. And this is just which of the new social contract tenets defined by Stiglitz is the most important to you? So quickly respond to that, and then we'll get to the next one that kind of addresses our last question. So I'm giving
like kids, you can't or like Pringles potato chips, you can't eat just one.
So it looks like we got 25% of folks have already responded. Gonna give it another 30 seconds before I end this poll. Which tenet of the new social contract by Stiglitz do you think is the most important? Poll is going to close in 10 seconds. I know it's quick, but for the sake of time.
Keep in mind, the 3 of us can't vote, Wes. So.
Oh, that's true. Yes. All right. Good. So the poll has ended. Here are the results. And I am looking, and every person's voice is heard, received the highest, but honestly, there were a lot with 2s, and so it was kind of a, diverse response. So thank you all for that. And let's get back to I'm going to launch the poll and I'll state it, and then Jamel, as that we are listening to you, folks can respond.
Sure.
So poll number 2, thinking about local elections or initiatives, whether in connection with local government, school board activities, or other regulations, have you ever reviewed a proposed law, rule, or initiative that was up for consideration or implementation? Have you seen a proposed law or implementation of a rule or initiative change because of public participation? Take it away, Jamel, as folks respond.
And then, so you'll see that you've got multiple, you can only choose one of those things. And some of it is I have participated and seen change, I've participated but not seen change, et cetera. I'll let you do that. But let me really quickly tell you about how you can have some visibility into the federal rulemaking process itself. And I think that it probably exists at other levels as well. And a lot of people don't know this. I put up there 2 resources. And the reason that I talk about this is because I was a regulator and I was a rule maker, and I was somebody who was with a group of people who had to review the comments that came in. And comments are reviewed and they are taken seriously and they are addressed. I put those 2 dashboards up there just to give you a taste of the information that's actually out there in terms of things that are going on in the rulemaking process. Now, some might be really technical things, but others are not. I used to be a part of the government that was focused on collecting information from financial institutions to fight against crime. A lot of issues there, in terms of, is this information good? Is it going to result in discrimination? Is it going to result in invasions of privacy? There were individuals as well as companies that would provide comments and responses to us. And you have to take all of those in consideration when you're making a rule. So if you're thinking about the social contract and you have a tenant that you feel particularly strongly about, I'd suggest, poke around in some of the stuff that's actually going on and think about how you might interject a comment or into the situation to say, I think that this rule, the principle of this rule might be good, but make sure you don't forget X or Y. Or I'd like to see more data collected with respect to how this might affect minority communities, things like that. Once you use that and you put it in the system, it's something that does have thousands of, well, honestly, sometimes there are thousands of responses. Sometimes it's just scores of responses. And I do think that government does take these things seriously. They're held accountable for how they look and address comments. So I just wanted you to have a piece of that, and maybe you might feel a little bit empowered afterwards.
Thank you, Jamel. And those links are within the reader's guide that Robin puts together for us. So be sure you take a look at those, and they'll be included in our follow-up.
And I put them in the chat too, so you can click on them if you want to click on them right now, you can too.
Appreciate that, Jamel. And here's the results of our poll, which that's awesome to see. At the local level, 54% of folks have participated, reviewed, and have seen change. So, Jamel, I feel like that also speaks to the power of getting involved locally, right?
Did you share the results?
Oh, no. Well, I thought I'm looking at them, but I didn't share them with you all. So, oops. So there they are. 54% have participated, reviewed, and seen change. 23% haven't, but it's awesome to see within this group here tonight that people have participated and reviewed, and more have seen change versus not. So that's always good.